Welcome everyone to our webinar, our 2017 Southern California Invasive Plants webinar. Thank you for making the time to spend your evening with us. We have a couple of great presentations lined up tonight, including our keynote presentation from Pamela Berstler, the CEO of Green Gardens Group, and our guest of honor. I'll give her a proper introduction in just a bit and before she shares her talk, but first I'd like to introduce myself. That's me on the left. My name is Stephanie and I'm a project manager here at PlantRight. I recently had my 1-year anniversary working at PlantRight and I'm looking forward to another stellar year and working with you on the survey again. Any further, let's get familiar with the webinar tool we're using tonight. It's YouTube Live. It's a little different than last year. The interactive comments don't work anymore, so it's going to work just like a regular YouTube video. And if you have any trouble, just try refreshing the page. In case you need to get up and refill your snack bowl, you can pause and resume just like a regular YouTube video. However, if you pause the video, note that when you resume, you will no longer be live. And if you want to skip ahead to catch up with us, you can just click the live button at the bottom left corner of the video screen. And the red dot signifies that you are live. Throughout the webinar, you can send us your questions at plantright@suscon.org, and we'll answer them at the end. If we run out of time, I promise I'll get back to you over email. Sit back and enjoy. A couple other notes. This webinar is being recorded and will become available at this link immediately after the event. So if you really enjoy it, you can share it with family or friends, or come back and review some of the material later. We'll also be posting this link to plantright.org, which we'll share later this week. UC Master Gardener, please check with your county's program coordinator to see if this webinar counts towards your continuing education credit requirement. And if you are a watershed-wise landscape professional, G3 will grant 1 CEU per hour, up to 4 hours for those who participate in the survey. And then once you're done with the webinar, you can go ahead and take that brief quiz, and once you pass that, you will be able to access all of the survey materials, claim nurseries, and complete the survey. That quiz is not meant to be difficult, but merely to make sure you're familiar with our program and the materials and how to conduct the survey. So, here's our agenda for the evening. As you see, we've broken up this webinar into 4 different sections. First, we'll cover the basics of what is an invasive plant and why we care. Then we'll hear from our guest of honor, Pamela, who will introduce you to the watershed approach to landscaping. Following her presentation, we'll finish up by sharing how you all can get more involved in our program, particularly by participating in the 2017 nursery survey. And last but not least, we'll save some time at the end for questions. Let's begin by explaining what invasive plants are. By definition, invasive plants are foreign or not native to an area. However, keep in mind that most non-native plants are not invasive. Also, just because a plant is invasive in a certain climate zone, like California's South Coast, does not necessarily make it invasive in others, like the Sierra Nevada or the Central Valley. But where they are invasive, these plants spread on their own, meaning that they don't need irrigation, soil amendments, or tillage in order to thrive. By spreading on their own, invasive plants cause measurable harm, whether it's financial, environmental, or to human health. But how do invasive plants actually cause harm? Let's take a look at a few examples. California has an incredible amount of plant diversity. This is just a tiny sampling of plants I've seen of the thousands that are native to California, some of which are endemic, meaning they are found nowhere else on Earth. And we do have some native thistle species, which is that pink flower on the bottom right. Invasive plants can outcompete the native plants and take over where they were once living. When we lose native plants in an area, we aren't just losing pretty flowers. We're losing the basis of the food chain and what wildlife depends on for food, reproduction, and for habitat. Those 2 butterflies in the top right photo are an example of what I'll be talking about next. A related species to those butterflies on the previous slide is the El Segundo blue butterfly, which historically had a population of about 750,000 and could be found in most of the El Segundo dunes in Los Angeles County. Much of its dune habitat was developed or degraded, destroying habitat outright, and in the places that were left, native plants were replaced with non-native plants like highway ice plant or Carpobrotus edulis. In this case, ice plant was planted for erosion control after builders had carved the dunes to build waterfront homes, an oil refinery, sewage plant, and the Los Angeles airport. The only plant that the El Segundo blue butterfly can lay its eggs on is coast buckwheat, shown in the photo on the left. So no buckwheat means no more El Segundo blue butterfly. And it was listed as an endangered species in 1976. One place where restoration has helped the butterfly is a coastal bluff on Redondo Beach that was covered in ice plant, as shown in the top photo on the right. The bottom photo shows the site after restoration, which included planting coast buckwheat and other native dune plants. These native plants also have a deeper root system than ice plant and will do a better job of stabilizing coastal bluffs compared to ice plant. Here's another example of how invasive plants can affect wildlife. The picture on the left is Arundo donax, also known as giant reed, which has replaced the willows, cottonwoods, and other native plants in over 10,000 acres of the Santa Ana River Basin, among other places in California where it's invasive. It's formed a monoculture and destroyed habitat for songbirds like the federally endangered least Bell's vireo, shown in the photo on the right. Giant reed is a poor food source for native birds, increases fire risk, and uses nearly 3 times as much water as native vegetation that the birds rely on for food and nesting sites. But things are looking up for the least Bell's vireo here. 3,000 acres of giant reed were removed, allowing the native plants to grow back. And by 2004, there were 413 pairs nesting of least Bell's vireo and 767 fledglings in the area compared to 19 pairs in 1986. Invasive plants can also alter soil composition. The Scotch broom on the left are nitrogen fixers, which deposit nitrogen into the soil, making it easier for other invasives to invade and harder for native plants to reestablish. Salt cedar, Tamarisk ramosissima, in the middle takes up a lot of water and deposits salts onto the ground, inhibiting the growth of other plants. And blue gum eucalyptus on the right has chemicals in its leaves that, when they decompose in the forest floor, will inhibit root growth of the seedlings of other species, which is known as allelopathy. Several invasive plants in California are highly flammable and can increase fire intensity, causing fires to burn bigger, hotter, and longer. These fires are expensive to control and can cause significant damage to private property and public infrastructure. Invasive plants can also alter hydrology, or the water cycle in a region. This picture here on the screen is not a meadow, but rather a stream in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta that has been completely taken over by water hyacinth. This not only reduces the flow of water and makes it difficult for terrestrial wildlife to access it, but it also destroys the aquatic wildlife underneath by reducing oxygen and sunlight levels. These water hyacinth invasions also have a significant economic impact on shipping and recreational boating and water storage in the delta. When invasive plants grow in cropland, they are considered weeds. As the top agricultural state in the country, a lot of money is spent controlling these weeds that result in lost agricultural yields and lowered land values. This is B.J. Burns, a fourth-generation farmer in San Mateo County. He was quoted as saying, "I'm several miles inland from where it was first planted, and we're seeing it now on the hillsides and along the creeks. There are places around here so choked with pampas grass you can't use the land to grow anything anymore." Altogether, invasive plants like this are very difficult and expensive to control. Each year, California spends over $80 million monitoring, mapping, and controlling invasive plants. But this doesn't take into account some of the harder to calculate costs, and it's likely much higher. Here's a summary table of the varied and significant impacts of invasive plants. While it certainly isn't exhaustive, it is part of why we think this issue is so important. Now, you might ask yourself, how did all these plants get here in the first place? If we're going to address this, we need to understand where they're coming from. In 2003, a University of California study revealed that almost half of invasive plants in California were introduced through the horticultural industry. However, it's important to note that many invasive plants like pampas grass were introduced over 100 years ago, before their invasive tendencies were known. And while only a small percent of ornamental plants we use become invasive, this showed us how important it is to partner with the industry going forward. But no one wants to introduce a problem plant. So how does this happen? There are some traits we desire for ornamental plants, like being easy to propagate and establish, growing rapidly, having a lot of flowers, tolerating a variety of climates and soil types, and resisting pests and diseases. Unfortunately, a lot of the traits we want in plants can sometimes lead them to become invasive. Thankfully, very few ornamental plants become invasive, but as you've seen, the ones that do can cause a lot of problems. This, in essence, is why we care, and is the motivation for why the Plant Right program was started. To give you a bit of background, Plant Right is run by this nonprofit, Sustainable Conservation. Sustainable conservation helps California thrive by uniting people to solve the toughest challenges facing our land, air, and water, we bring together businesses, landowners, and government to steward the resources that we all depend on in ways that make economic sense. We do this because we believe that finding common ground is the best way to protect California's resources. We recognize the importance of the issue of invasive plants, and in 2005 brought together a diverse alliance of leaders from the 4 sectors you see on the screen. Together, these leaders created the Plant Right program to tackle this issue in a way that is collaborative, voluntary, and science-based. These diverse stakeholders remain involved as our steering committee, meeting about once a quarter to help guide our work. After convening our steering committee in 2005, we went to work developing a regional plant list to help identify the plants of biggest concern and where they're problematic. The list was originally developed based on the more exhaustive California Invasive Plant Council list, but was pared down to focus on the most commonly sold invasive garden plants that gardeners might encounter in nurseries and garden centers. And because Plant Right's all about coaching the do's instead of just the don'ts, we've also identified more than 50 beautiful alternative plants that work well in place of these invasives. We started our retail nursery partnership program in 2013, and we've been conducting outreach and education through a variety of programs. Currently, there are 4 main tiers of our program, as shown here on the screen. I'll describe them briefly, and I invite you to learn more about these through our website. Nursery partnership was developed to help us address the issue with nurseries and garden centers, provide them with resources on invasive plants, and support them in promoting non-invasive plants for their customers. Evaluator was developed, also known as PRE, was developed to provide a decision support framework for plant developers, propagators, and growers to evaluate the risk of a plant being invasive before it's been introduced somewhere. This tool to new plants before they're introduced, we can focus on preventing the next big invader rather than playing catch-up after it's already become a problem. Our continuing education program was launched at the end of 2013 to address the lack of awareness about invasive plants, where species are problematic, and why it truly matters. And last but not least, our nursery survey. I'll share more about the survey and how to get involved a little bit later. But without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker. We'll be introducing you to the watershed approach to landscaping. I went to a full-day workshop led by Pamela and loved it, so I hope you all will enjoy this presentation. Pamela is a highly experienced landscape expert who co-founded and now manages G3 Green Gardens Group, an organization dedicated to using landscapes as a climate change solution. G3 is a US EPA WaterSense recognized professional certifying organization and conducts outreach and education on the watershed approach to landscaping for homeowners and professionals throughout the United States.
So good evening, everybody. I am very excited to be here this evening to share with you some information about the watershed approach for California landscapes. And this is not really a new way of doing landscaping, but it's a new way of thinking about landscaping. So here it is. This is the watershed approach. Here's the challenge that we have. In order to combat drought, this kind of landscape was proposed as a way to save water. Or this kind of landscape, covered in gravel, weed barrier, a couple little succulents stuck here and there. I mean, this is definitely not the watershed approach, and this is but this is very prevalent for drought-tolerant landscaping. But then we have the issue of what happens when we get rain. We're not actually planning on rain with those drought-tolerant gardens. In fact, those gardens would have shed a lot of water and made it even a worse kind of flooding situation. So they're not really working for us in either drought or in a flood situation. We need to turn the landscape paradigm on its head. We need to shift everything and rethink how we approach landscaping. And that would be the watershed approach. Now, you're probably wondering, what the heck is all this stuff about the word watershed? I mean, you know, what does it mean anyway? Well, the EPA has a definition of the watershed, and it's pretty simple. It's an area of land where all the water that falls on it or all the water that's under it drains to the same place. And this is really important for us to remember because it's just an area of land where all the water gathered on it is flowing off to one place. but it has a particular kind of function. And I just want to take a second to look at this slide and talk about the function of a healthy watershed. You can see in this picture that water is coming from the sky in whatever form, precipitation or fog, and it's being intercepted by plants, grabbed in the leaves, held on, flowing on the stems, and really saturating the plants first. And then it makes its way to the soil beneath the plants, and it begins it begins to move. Now, here's something that you have to remember about water in a landscape. Water is in constant motion. So you particularly begin to see this when it starts moving through the landscape. Some of the water will begin to flow over the land, and it'll begin moving toward that common waterway, like in this picture, we have the river. Or gravity will start to work on that water and start pulling it down through the soil, in through the roots of the plants, and it'll begin to infiltrate into the soil, and some of it maybe will even percolate all the way down into the water table and start filling that. Other water might get stuck at some level and begin then moving through capillary action to the local river or waterway. But the key here is that any water that comes into this system is held first in the plants and in the shallow groundwater and in the root zone of those plants until that's all nice and full. And then that water becomes available for the local waterways. And in the process, it's cleaned and filtered by the plants and soil before it makes it to the waterways. That's how a healthy watershed works. And then the sun comes out and that water is brought back up out of the soil and out of the plants into the sky to form clouds to start the process all over again. And that healthy, balanced watershed that you see here in this picture, that is what we are striving to do. Now, you may think, when you hear this word watershed, that we're talking about giant areas, some vast amount of space. And you're familiar with the term watershed in the context of sort of the hydrological watershed, where does our water come from? But you'll see that we are actually starting to use this term watershed to apply it to any property and scale it down so that every property becomes a mini watershed. And this is really the important thing for us to remember, and this is why we call it the watershed approach. Every property can be looked at as though it's a mini watershed. We can find the top of the watershed, which is usually the roof, and we can find the bottom, which is where the water is running off the property. And we have control over every single thing that happens inside our mini watershed. And that's why we want to concentrate on that. And if every single one of us treated every property as though it were a mini watershed and applied the principles that we're going to talk about to that watershed, we would actually have greater environmental benefits for the whole watershed. And that's really where we're coming from with this. There are essentially 4 principles of the watershed approach. And these, I'm going to talk about each of them in some depth, but just to review them, they are building healthy living soil. And this is really called making a soil sponge. It holds on to water when there isn't a lot of it out of there, and it also releases water when there is too much. Works as a perfect sponge. And that's a really important fundamental thing for us to be building. The second thing is rainwater is a resource. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Then climate appropriate plants. And part of climate appropriate plants is actually also no invasive plants. Really, we want to be rebuilding an ecosystem that benefits all of the creatures, humans included, but all the creatures in that environment. And so climate appropriate plants needs to include no invasives. And then finally, we have highly efficient irrigation, but only when necessary. And there are a couple pieces to this. The first is that the equipment and the design and the management of the irrigation is very efficient, but also that you're only using it when you don't have sufficient rainwater. And then Also, you're thinking about irrigation from the point of view of how do I reduce the amount of potable or drinking water that I'm applying to the landscape. So you would be looking first to using rainwater as irrigation, and you'd be looking then to maybe gray water, and then maybe after that recycled water, and finally potable water only as a last resort. The most important part of the watershed approach is building the living soil sponge. And it's important for us to remember that soil is actually alive. It is comprised, and yes, you've all seen the charts that have, the little minerals and the air and the water, and then this tiny little thing that says organic matter. But actually, the microbes in soil comprise a huge amount of soil. They're the essential ingredient, really, for making soil a sponge. And it is those microbes that are necessary for intermediating every single thing that happens with the plant. These microbes cycle nutrients for the plant so they can eat. They build an immune system for plants. And feeding this living soil sponge is really the most important thing that we can do to creating a watershed-wise landscape. And you can see that when we had that slide in the beginning that showed sort of the idealized watershed area, that I talked a lot about how water was held in the soil. Really, it is this soil sponge that defines the watershed approach. So after we build our soil by adding organic matter and making it super healthy and building up all those microbes, we want to make sure that we are gathering as much rainwater as we possibly can and utilizing that first as a resource for the landscape. Now, if you're familiar with rain barrels and cisterns, you may think, how am I going to hold on to all of that water? Especially, we've been experiencing a lot of rain recently. But here's the deal. First, we need to understand that from every roof, we could actually collect a huge amount of water that could be stored in the soil for the benefit of the plants. And if we've made a sponge, it could actually stay there in the soil for a really long time into the summer. And one thing that I always like to point out to people is that for a 1,000 square foot roof, 600 gallons of water can be gathered from that roof for every inch of rain. So imagine how much water that actually would be that we could grab from a roof. But the corollary to how much water we could grab is understanding that we would only need an area 150 square feet in size, 6 inches deep, to hold on to those 620 gallons. So the reason I'm bringing up, so many numbers, and it may sound a tiny little bit confusing, but I'm bringing this up for you to understand that, yes, we get a lot more water off of a roof than we can gather up quickly in a rain barrel. If we put it in the soil, we don't need that much space in order for it to be that first 1 inch, which is the most important and polluted part that we really want to hold on to. It really isn't a very large area that we have to remediate or that we have to use. And pretty much every single garden has this 150 square feet that we can utilize only 6 inches deep. So as I said, the soil is actually creating a storage area that is far greater than any cistern or any barrel could ever create. This area is called the green water zone, and I'm telling you this because these are terms that you're likely to hear a lot more of in the coming years as we go through cycles of drought and abundance, as we have been here in California over the last 4 or 5 years. The green water zone is the critical zone of the root depth of the plants, where all the carbon is stored and where the microbes are busy holding on to oxygen and water and cycling nutrients for the plants. This is where landscaping is most critical for us to be thinking about, and this green water zone is the most important thing for us to be managing really in our landscapes. All of this means that we have to start contouring our landscapes in order to hold on to rainwater and capture as much as we possibly can. And we may actually need to start working with our local municipalities and statewide organizations to find other ways to gather rainwater in our landscapes. This is an example of a curb cut that was done with the blessing of the municipality, and it takes water from the street and puts it into the landscape for the benefit of the plants in the parkway instead of having grass that's irrigated. So now we have built the living soil and we've directed rainwater into the living soil. Now let's select plants that require as little water as possible. And so this is essentially a process by which we start using our understanding of evapotranspiration and our understanding of how much water various plants require as compared to cool season turf grass. And you can see here on the left-hand side that column of water that cool season grass would require 50 or more inches of water every year. And then there are plants that are from our California native, very dry land plants that would require no more than 5 inches of water a year. And this is a really critical analysis for us to begin to add to our landscape design process, to be thinking about how little water can we design for. And we need to know that when we make choices for low water requiring plants, we are not sacrificing beauty at all. In fact, we are creating truly California landscapes, which are, in my opinion, among the most beautiful landscapes in the entire world. And the way to do that is to understand our plant material and begin to select more California native plants. I mentioned that the fourth element of a watershed-wise landscape is to utilize highly efficient irrigation to supplement the rain. And there are a couple of different types of irrigation. It's important to remember that efficient irrigation is a combination of the actual materials, either rotating spray nozzles or drip irrigation. It's a combination of selecting the correct device, but it's also about designing a system that is efficient and managing it so that it's efficient. In other words, using weather-based irrigation controllers or utilizing your own understanding of how evapotranspiration works. Highly efficient irrigation may be necessary even when we're gathering lots of rainwater, and to supplement that, to supplement the rainwater in times when we're not getting a lot of rain. And this is kind of a subtle point, but I want to just mention it, that if you have a California native landscape that is adapted to our climate, in most cases, you will not be irrigating in the summertime if you have built living soil and are capturing rainwater. The time that you would be irrigating a watershed-wise landscape is in the winter time, and that would be only if we weren't getting rain from the sky. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about building your landscapes. So what does it take for us to shift from our rather conventional way of thinking about landscapes? You know, we live in California, all these great plants grow here, whether they are California natives or whether they're climate appropriate or not. You know, just add water. How do we shift from that attitude to an attitude that is truly watershed wise? Because there are lots of programs out there that are called water-wise programs. And here's a great example of a water-wise program. This is a transformation that was done on a landscape, removing grass and replacing it with decomposed granite and some plants that are essentially dry land plants. But the challenge here is that it qualified as a water-saving program, or a water-saving landscape, but it is not a watershed-wise landscape. And so as a result, it's not holding on to rainwater. These plants are going to require irrigation in the summertime, and all that hard surface is just going to shed rainwater when it comes, causing more flooding. So here we have another landscape that was converted, and this you can see has a completely different outcome. This landscape is a landscape that holds on to water. Look at all that mulch. We have California native plants. We're using drip irrigation. This is a landscape that can survive drought and does not contribute to flooding when it does rain. So this is really where we're trying to go. We have found that in order to make the shift from the old way of landscaping to watershed-wise, that people need some clear guidance. Look at this happy guy. He's so happy because he spent about $700 completely converting his front yard with some guidance. G3 has actually created several standard books sets of metrics for various water agencies and nonprofits. You can go on our website, greengardensgroup.com, to download any one of the 3 books that you see on your screen, or the Surfrider Ocean Friendly Gardens parameters in order to get a Surfrider sign on your landscape. And we've also worked very closely with water agencies to help develop new types of turf removal rebate standards, which is really the next generation of cash for grass programs. We also find that in order for people to be successful, we need to have lots of professionals out there that are engaged in this dialogue about watershed-wise landscapes and hold certifications in the techniques that will make landscapes watershed-wise. G3 is an EPA water sense certifying organization that has a program called the Watershed-Wise Landscape Professional. And so we do provide these certifications, do provide a lot of training in how to evaluate a landscape for its watershed, as a watershed rather, and for its potential to be restored as a watershed. So we've heard enough about this, and actually after all this rain, it's kind of hard to imagine we even said that. But we see that this idea that in times of drought, that just turning off our sprinklers or just building landscapes that are purely thinking about how to save water are not going to help us in the long term, because when that rain does come, we're going to be even in deeper trouble. I almost said deeper water. So we really need to focus on building the soil and on building that sponge and making the landscape something that is functioning as a healthy and resilient landscape, whether we have drought or flood. So we're just not going to go back to the old way. The old way, even though the rains have come, we're not going back to the days of fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and just adding as much water as we want because it happens to be there in the, in the dams. We're going to start thinking differently. We're going to start thinking about how do we have landscapes that can be beautiful with less impact. And this is an example of a landscape that doesn't have any herbicides applied to it. And you can see, as a result, it's not just a big green carpet, but everybody can still play on it, dogs and people, and you can roll around in it and not worry about getting pesticides and so forth on you. So watershed-wise applies to the landscape, it applies to commercial sites, it applies to residential sites, and it even applies to these little parkway strips in between the street and the sidewalk where we used to have turf grass and now we could have strawberry, which is what you see in this picture, the California native strawberry. And Stephanie promised me that I could do a little plug before I went into showing you some of the beautiful pictures of watershed-wise landscapes. This is a plug for our upcoming Soil Summit in Los Angeles, August 7th through 9th. It's an amazing experience to learn more about how soil how we interact with soil in urban environments and suburban environments to the benefit of landscapes and people. And now I'd just like to show you some landscapes that are watershed-wise. You can see from these pictures that we have high schools, we have colleges, we have city halls, and you know, they're all different. All the landscapes look different. There's a residential landscape in San Diego and residential landscapes in West Los Angeles, and they can be Spanish, they can be modern, they can be any Tudor, any kind of home, any kind of landscape. But what's important is how they are functioning. And so you see they're in Ventura. This is the watershed approach, and I'm happy to answer questions when we go to the Q&A time. The last slide is my contact information.
There we go. Thank you so much, Pamela. So I bet after this, many of you will start noticing how water flows in your little watershed. I definitely did after going to that full-day workshop with Pamela. And now I'm excited to share with you a bit more about the nursery survey. First, I'll give you a bit of background. We've already covered how why invasive plants pose a risk to natural environments. And our nursery survey allows us to track these plants back to their source, identifying existing invasive plants in the horticultural industry so we can address them before they become a bigger problem in natural environments. The nursery survey has a very significant and beneficial impact on the Plant Right project overall. It acts as our program's compass, allowing us to track the retail sale of plants so we know where they're being sold and by whom. And it gives us a sense of what plants continue to be sold so we can keep our plant list up to date, removing plants that are no longer sold and adding new threats as they're realized. Form our strategy for effectively engaging the retail industry and influences the rest of our programs. Our 2016 Spring Nursery Survey was our 7th annual, and it was our biggest success yet. Last year, we worked with 175 volunteers to collect data from 302 stores in 46 counties throughout the state. And I personally couldn't be more thrilled with the level of participation we had. So let's get into the details. Due to the seasonal nature of gardening and horticulture, with the time of spring varying regionally, we split our survey into 2 regions with different timing. In Southern California, including and south of San Luis Obispo, Kern, and San Bernardino counties, our survey will begin on February 27th and run through May. In Northern California, which is north of San Luis Obispo, Kern, and San Bernardino counties, our survey runs from April 3rd through June 20th. Of course, when spring arrives in your area, it can vary greatly, so try to visit nurseries once they have a lot of plants in stock. Feel free to call ahead and check. This year, we've randomly selected over 320 stores from the thousands in the California Department of Food and Ag's online directory. This selection process is random for statistical purposes and is done proportionally to the population in each county. Let's review how to get involved. The steps include creating an account on plantright.org. You can complete our short 5-question quiz, select a store or few to survey in your region, and gather the appropriate materials. Then you will visit the store and collect data, submit your data and any photos you took on the Plant Right website, and finally, provide us with feedback on your experience. This last part is optional, but certainly encouraged. We enjoy hearing your input and suggestions for improving our survey in the future. All of these steps, except of course actually visiting the stores you signed up for, will be completed on our website. Here's a screenshot of our website, plantright.org. The first thing you want to do is log in, which you can do down here on the bottom left part of the screen, where it shows email or username and password. If you have an account but simply can't remember your username or password, you can click the Request New Password link to have access info sent to your email address. If you do not have an account or want to create a new one with a different email address, you can do so by clicking the link to create new account. and follow instructions to create a spring survey account in the middle of this page. After logging in, the Spring Survey tab will appear in the menu on the left-hand side of the page. Next, you'll want to take the short 5-question quiz by clicking the link marked by the arrow. These questions are designed to be straightforward and easy, especially for returning volunteers like you, and they simply exist to ensure that you viewed the webinar or refresher video. To pass, you must answer at least 4 out of the 5 questions correctly. But don't worry, you'll be able to take the quiz more than once. After passing the quiz, you'll be taken to the instructions page, which should serve as your home base. You can access it through the instructions link in the sidebar, as shown by the arrow. It walks you through each stage of the survey process and includes links to all of the relevant materials. You can also find these materials in the Survey Materials tab, shown by this arrow. As you'll see, your first step is to review the list of nurseries to survey. You can access this list through the sidebar, shown by the arrow, or through a link in the instructions text. Nurseries will become available for sign-up on our website at noon on February 27th in Southern California and April 3rd in Northern California. After they are posted, the nursery page will look something like this. To make it easier to find a nursery near you, you can sort by county. Once you find a store you'd like to survey, click the text on the right-hand side of the screen where it says Survey this nursery. This will take you to a new page that asks you if you are sure you'd like to survey this nursery, and after you click yes, a few things will happen. You'll receive a confirmation email from our system with information about the store, and this store will drop off the list of available nurseries. If you would like to see information on the nurseries you signed up for, just click the My Nurseries link in the sidebar menu, where all of the nurseries you've claimed will show up. If for some reason you are unable to survey your nursery and would like to unclaim it, you can do so on the My Nurseries page by clicking the individual store you'd like to unclaim, and then clicking the Unclaim This Nursery link at the bottom of the page. What happens if you go to the nursery list and find there are no stores left? If that's the case, we recommend you get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to help you find a store or two that will work for you. In some cases, there could be stores in neighboring counties that would also work well for you. Perhaps you're already planning a trip, or you're relatively close to the county border, and a store isn't too far away. Sometimes this can be a great way for counties with extra volunteers to help counties with fewer. If you're interested in surveying a store outside your county, we recommend you wait about 2 weeks after the stores become available before signing up, to allow volunteers in that county to do so if they're interested. Once you've chosen a nursery to survey, your next step is to gather materials. These materials include survey instructions, survey form, plant ID guide, and explanation sheet. These materials are available on our website, found at the Survey Materials link, as well as on the instructions page. We recommend that you print these and take them with you to your store, and especially the plant ID guide in color. If you're unable to print any of these, let us know and we'll be happy to mail them to you. Here's the survey instructions checklist. It's very similar to the instructions page on our website, but we recommend you take this with you in case you don't have an internet connection and have some questions while you're at the store. Here's the survey form. This form includes each of the plants on our survey and has space for each item of information we'd like to collect. It's 4 pages long this year to give you extra space for writing. The list is organized by growth type, as I've highlighted in orange here with the grasses, and includes space for basic information like the date and your name at the top of the form. In particular, I'd like to highlight the space for the store code. You identify the store by a code rather than by name in order to protect the store's identity and conduct our survey in best faith with the industry. There's also a space for additional information on how long it took you to conduct your survey and what the store's response was, if it had one. I'd also like to highlight the space for cultivar name and/or plants in the same genus. A plant may have a cultivar name when it is a variety of an existing plant species, and these cultivar names are commonly in single quotations. For example, the cultivar of Cordaderia celoana ivory feathers. We ask that you record this information here, along with the names of any plants you find in the same genus as plants on our list, such as different types of pennisedums, or stipa, or nacella. If you find an especially large number of cultivars, simply list as many as you can in this section, or in this section for notes at the bottom of the page. One thing you'll notice as you're trying to record all this information is that the signage for each of these stores will be different. We might not always have all the information available to us, like scientific names on the labels, or the name of the grower, etc. And with that in mind, we simply ask that you do the best you can and record all of the information that is available to you. Next, we have the Plant ID Guide with pictures of each of the plants on our survey this year. Often these plants look very different in stores than they do in the wild. So to help you identify these plants, we've included photos of them at nurseries if possible, and sometimes a couple of photos for each one. They are grouped by growth type just like on the survey form, with grasses and forbs on the first page, a couple more forbs, some shrubs, ground cover, and water plants on the second page. The plants we're serving for this year include the usual suspects, the 4 plants still remaining from our original list, plus the 3 plants that were added in 2014. We're also surveying for 9 candidate plants this year, and I want to emphasize that just because a plant is included as a candidate in our survey doesn't mean that it's a plant you should avoid using in your garden. They're still under investigation, and remember that invasiveness varies by where you are in the state. On our new website, we'll have information about plants like these and our past candidate plants. 3 of these candidate plants are grasses, and 2 of them are species of Pennisetum. There are several cultivars of Pennisetum alopecuroides, but Pennisetum villosum should just be found as the straight species. Phalaris arundinaceae, also known as reed canary grass, is most likely to be found as a cultivar. Picta and strawberries and cream are 2 of the more commonly sold ones. We're surveying for 3 forbs this year, as well as these 3 shrubs. We surveyed for petite licorice last year, and as we only found it at 1 store, we wanted to survey for it again to see if we'll find it at any more stores. The last material on this list is our explanation sheet. This contains background information about PlantRight, our survey, and answers to some frequently asked questions, which you can use to answer questions you might encounter during your visit. This leads us again to the question of how exactly you should interact with store staff. We do our best to conduct this survey in good faith with the nursery industry. Since this survey is not tied to any regulatory efforts, and all information is kept confidential, there's no risk to stores. As a result, we do welcome you to inform these stores that you are there to conduct the survey. No disguises are necessary. If you find yourself talking with a store employee, this would be a good opportunity to use the explanation sheet. It has a lot of good talking points, and you can leave it with store staff if you would like. We encourage you to refer staff to PlantRight's website, included on the explanation sheet, if they have a question you are unsure how to answer, or they'd like to learn more. If you would prefer not to engage the store staff, that's okay too. Information gathering like this happens in the industry, and our survey is not unique. In the unlikely event that you are asked not to complete the survey, please respect the store's request and leave courteously. If this happens, please let us know and we can address this on a case-by-case basis. This has happened only a couple of times over the past few years, but we'd like you to be prepared. Lastly, I'd like to remind you all that the purpose of the survey is data collection and not outreach, so we kindly ask that you refrain from doing any advocacy during your survey visit. Once you have all your materials, your next step is to visit the store. We recommend you give yourself 45 to 90 minutes for the survey. How long it will actually take depends on the store size, layout, and how well plants are labeled. I tried to make a note on the online nursery list if it's a particularly large nursery and you may want to bring a friend. It's helpful to note that annuals, indoor plants, edibles, and native plants will not show up on our list, so you can skip these sections entirely. If you find an invasive plant, the first thing you'll want to do is record the available information on the survey form. Next, you'll want to take a photo of the plant. We ask that you take at least 2 photos, one of the plant itself and one close-up of the plant label. These photos are very important and allow us to verify the identity of the plant. Without a photo, we can't count it in the results. In some cases, plants can be mislabeled. If there's extra confusion, please collect all the information you see and take a few extra photos to help us verify the plant's identity. We also ask that you take and submit photos of the cultivars you find of the invasive plants on our list. To give you an example, let's consider Pennisetum cetaceum, green fountain grass, here on the screen. This plant has many cultivars, some of which are not problematic, including this cultivar, Fireworks, Bunny Tails, Fairy Tales, and this one, Eaton Canyon. If you find an unreasonably large number of cultivars, do not feel obligated to submit a photo of each one. Simply list them on the data collection form, as we mentioned above. And remember, there's no need to include photos of related plants like Pennisetum orientale, which is in the same genus Pennisetum but is a different species, unless it's Pennisetum alopecuroides or Pennisetum villosum, which are on our survey. For the other ones, just note their presence on the data sheet. Sometimes photos can be distant, blurry, or lacking in reference, which makes it difficult for us to verify these plants. Because these photos are so critical, we'd like to emphasize the importance of taking clear photos. And if you have a digital camera or you're using your phone, please check them over before you leave the store in case you need to take another one. And remember, there's no harm in taking some extra photos. If it's an especially beautiful day, you particularly like the layout of a store, or find some quirky installments, send a few photos our way. We'd really love to have some photos of you volunteering and your team. Once you finish your surveys, you'll need to get back online to submit your data. After you've logged into our website, you'll see the options for Submit a Survey and Upload Photos. Click the Submit a Survey tab on the left side of the screen and you'll be taken to a submission page that has fields identical to the survey form. You'll simply select the store you surveyed, input your data, and click Submit. After you transfer your photos from your camera to your computer, you can submit them online by clicking the Upload Photos tab. You can choose which pictures to upload by clicking the Photo button right below the photo you see here. In the description field, please enter the plant name and whether it is the plant or the tag. You can also upload photos directly from your smartphone to our website. After submitting results, you'll receive a confirmation email, which will include a link to a voluntary feedback questionnaire. And just like that, you're finished. If you are a Master Gardener, don't forget to log your volunteer service hours online through the Master Gardener Volunteer Management System. If you are a watershed-wise landscape professional, you can get 1 CEU per hour up to 4 hours. Email ceu@greengardensgroup.com. The contact information for Pamela and I. You can always send me a question at either of those email addresses for myself and PlantRight. I answer both of them. And with that, thank you so much for attending. And we hope you enjoy participating in the nursery survey.